heard my phone buzz against the nightstand at exactly 11:04 p.m. I almost let it go, but the screen showed a name I hadn't expected. Priya. My neighbor. Married. 2 houses down. Her message said only one line. My husband's asleep. Are you free to talk? I sat up in the dark and stared at those 9 words for almost a full minute before I answered. I had no idea that single text would take apart everything I thought I understood about being alone, about being careful, about staying inside the lines I had drawn for myself after my divorce. But before I tell you what happened after I typed back yes, you need to know who I was before that message ever landed on my screen. My name is Nathaniel Cross. I'm 37 years old, and I work as a sound engineer, mixing records out of a converted garage studio behind my house in Asheville, North Carolina. It's quiet work. Most people picture rock and roll chaos when they hear sound engineer. But the truth is, I spend most of my hours alone in a small room lit by soft red knobs and glowing meters, listening to the same 4 bars of a song over and over until the balance feels right. I like that kind of focus. It doesn't ask anything of me except attention. And attention is the one thing I've always had plenty to give. I live in a single-story craftsman house on Montford Avenue that I bought 2 years after my divorce finalized. Wraparound porch, a detached garage I converted into the studio, and a backyard that backs up against a strip of old hardwood trees that turn gold every October. I bought the house because it was quiet, because it didn't remind me of anyone, and because the previous owner had left behind a porch swing that creaked in a rhythm I found strangely comforting the very first night I slept there. My marriage to Renee lasted 6 years. No kids. It ended the way a lot of marriages end, without headlines, without a single scene anyone could point to and say, that's where it broke. She wanted a husband who filled the room, who worked the crowd at her law firm's holiday parties, who had opinions loud enough to be heard over a dinner table of 8 people. I gave her someone who preferred a pair of good headphones and a closed door. She called it emotional unavailability. I called it knowing what I needed to feel calm. We were both right, which somehow made it worse. We signed the papers on a Thursday afternoon in a lawyer's office that smelled like burnt coffee, and I drove home alone, and that was that. After the divorce, my life took on a shape that fit me the way an old flannel fits after enough washes, soft at the seams, nothing pinching anywhere. I woke at 6, ran a loop through Montford before the tourists clogged the greenway, worked in the studio until the light went orange behind the trees, and ate dinner standing at my kitchen counter listening to whatever record I was mixing that week. I wasn't lonely exactly. I told myself that a lot. I had gotten so good at being alone that I sometimes forgot loneliness and solitude aren't the same animal wearing the same coat. Priya Malhotra moved in 2 houses down about 14 months before that text arrived. She and her husband, Adrian, bought the blue bungalow with the wraparound porch that mirrored mine almost exactly, except theirs had rose bushes along the front walk that she clearly tended herself, because Adrian never seemed to be outside for longer than it took to load his car and drive off to whatever meeting was eating his weekend. I met her the way you meet most neighbors, over a fence in passing, with a wave that means nothing beyond acknowledgement that we share a street. She was maybe 34, dark hair always pulled back loose. The kind of woman who looked like she was constantly solving a problem in her head, even when she was just watering the roses. She worked as a hospital pharmacist, night shifts more often than not, which I only learned because I saw her car pull out of the driveway at odd hours and pull back in even odder ones. The first real conversation we had happened by accident. I was hauling a broken porch railing out to the curb for trash pickup, wrestling with a stubborn nail, when she walked over holding 2 glasses of iced tea like she'd been planning to bring them over before she even saw me struggling. "You look like you're losing that fight," she said, handing me a glass. I laughed, took it, and thanked her. She stood there while I finished, not talking much, just present, watching the way you watch someone work when you don't feel obligated to fill the silence. That should have been the whole story right there. A neighbor being neighborly. But small things kept happening after that, small enough that I explained each one away individually, the way you talk yourself out of noticing a pattern, because acknowledging the pattern means acknowledging what it implies. She started walking her dog past my house at the exact hour I usually took my coffee out to the porch. Every single morning, like clockwork, 7:15, her golden retriever pulling toward my yard, and she'd wave, sometimes stop for 2 minutes of small talk about nothing, then keep walking. She noticed I drank my coffee black. She never asked. She just clocked it the way people clock things they pay attention to without meaning to. Once, during a bad thunderstorm that knocked the power out across half of Montford, I heard a knock at my door around 9 at night. It was Priya, holding 2 battery lanterns. "Adrian's got the generator going for his office," she said, a little sheepish. "But I didn't want you sitting here in the dark alone." I took the lanterns. I didn't ask why she'd thought of me instead of any of the other 5 houses on our street that had also lost power. I should have asked. I didn't. I want to be honest about something. Adrian Malhotra was, by every visible measure, a good provider. He worked in commercial real estate, drove a car that cost more than my studio equipment, and kept their lawn immaculate through a service he clearly paid for and never touched himself. But I noticed things too. The way you notice things about people you've decided not to think too hard about. Adrian rarely looked at Priya when she spoke. He answered questions posed to her. He referred to their house as my investment in casual conversation at the one barbecue I attended on their street. And once, standing at my mailbox, I heard him on the phone in his driveway saying, loud enough to carry, "She doesn't need to work nights, I keep telling her that," in the tone of a man discussing a decision that had already been made without the other person's input. Priya told me about her marriage in pieces over those 14 months, never all at once the way water finds its way through wood over years instead of days. She said Adrian had wanted her to quit the hospital when they got engaged. She said no. She said it was the first real disagreement of their relationship and also, somehow, the last one she'd won outright. She told me once, standing at the fence line at dusk with her dog sniffing at my rose bed, that being a pharmacist was the only part of her life that still felt entirely hers. "Everything else in my house," she said, "has his name on it somewhere. Even the towels match his color scheme, not mine." She laughed when she said it, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that meant something was funny. I kept telling myself this was just what neighbors talk about, just 2 people living close enough to become familiar. I did not let myself examine why I looked forward to 7:15 every morning the way other people look forward to payday. Then came the night with the leaking pipe. It was late September, nearly 11 at night, and I heard frantic knocking. Priya stood on my porch soaked from running through a light rain, Adrian out of town for one of his endless deal-closing trips. Her kitchen sink pipe had burst. I grabbed my toolbox and spent almost 2 hours under her sink with a wrench and a headlamp, while she held a flashlight and handed me tools without being asked which one I needed next. When it was fixed, she made 2 cups of tea, and we sat at her kitchen island until nearly 1 in the morning, talking about nothing that mattered, and everything that did. She told me about a childhood in Charlotte, a father who'd wanted her to become a doctor instead of a pharmacist, a mother who died when Priya was 19. I told her about the studio, about Renee, about the strange piece of mixing a song until every instrument finally sits where it should. Walking home that night, I stood in my own driveway for a long moment before going inside, and I let myself admit something I had been refusing to admit for months. I liked her, not in the neighborly way, in the way that made my chest feel tight when her name showed up on my phone. I didn't act on it. I want to be clear about that, because what happened next depends on you understanding I never crossed a line while Priya was still fully inside her marriage. I kept my distance for weeks after that pipe repair, turning down her invitations to sit on the porch, finding excuses to be in the studio when her dog walked past at 7:15. I told myself distance was the responsible thing. I told myself a lot of things that autumn. Then, on a Tuesday night in late October, my phone buzzed at 11:04 p.m. "My husband's asleep. Are you free to talk?" I stared at those words for a long minute, the porch swing creaking faintly outside my window in the wind, before I typed back, "Yeah. Everything okay?" She didn't answer right away. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, "Can you come outside? I don't want to call, I don't want to wake him." I pulled on a jacket and walked out onto my porch. She was standing at the edge of her yard, arms crossed over a thin cardigan, the porch light behind her, throwing her shadow long across the grass. I walked down to meet her at the fence line between our properties, the same spot where she'd told me about her mother. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "This is insane, showing up like this." "You didn't show up," I said. "You texted." "There's a difference." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, the kind that comes out when someone's been holding something too tight for too long. "Adrian wants to move to Charlotte, for the job. He already put in an offer on a house there. He didn't tell me until after the offer was accepted." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth like she could push the emotion back down where it came from. I didn't say anything right away. I let the silence hold the way. I had learned to let silence hold with her. because I understood by then that she didn't need me to fill it. After a moment, she continued, I have a job here. I have a life here. He didn't ask me. He told me. She looked up at me, eyes wet in the porch light. I didn't know who else to talk to at 11 at night. I know that's strange. It's not strange, I said. It's just late. We stood at that fence for almost an hour. She told me things that night she'd never said out loud before, not even to me during the pipe repair conversation. She told me Adrian had made every major decision of their marriage without consulting her, the house, the car, even which fertility clinic they'd visited 2 years earlier when they'd tried and failed to have a baby, an appointment he'd booked before she'd agreed to try at all. She told me she'd stop bringing up disagreements because disagreements with Adrian didn't end in compromise. They ended in her exhaustion outlasting his patience, until she simply stopped fighting. I want to tell you I said something wise that night, something that fixed things. I didn't. I just listened, the way I listen to a mix that isn't right yet, waiting to understand what's actually wrong before I touch a single knob. When she finally said goodnight and walked back toward her dark house, she turned once at her front steps and said, Thank you for being awake. I stood at the fence long after her door closed, and something inside my chest had rearranged itself in a way I didn't have a name for yet. That 11 o'clock text became the first of many. Not every night. Maybe twice a week, sometimes 3, always after Adrian had gone to sleep. Always some version of the same 9 words. My husband's asleep. Are you free to talk? I always said yes. We never talked long, 30 minutes at most, standing at that fence line in whatever weather the Carolina fall handed us, cold enough some nights that I could see her breath catch in the porch light. I told myself this was friendship. I told myself a woman in a difficult marriage needed someone who would simply listen without an agenda, and I could be that person without wanting anything more. I believed it because I needed to believe it. Believing it let me keep showing up at that fence without asking myself what I actually wanted from those conversations. But there were signs I couldn't unsee even while I refused to name them. She started remembering things about me the way I'd noticed she remembered things about Adrian's preferences without being asked. Except now the noticing ran in my direction. She knew which nights I had late mixing sessions because my studio light stayed on later. She started leaving a thermos of coffee on my porch some mornings before her hospital shift. Black, no sugar, no note, gone before I ever saw her do it. Once she asked me to play her something I was working on, and when the track ended, she sat quiet for almost a full minute before saying, You put something real into that. I don't think Adrian's ever put something real into anything in his whole life. Then, in mid-November, everything changed direction. Adrian came home early from a supposed overnight trip and found Priya's car gone from the driveway at nearly midnight. She was at my kitchen table, not doing anything more than drinking tea after a rough shift at the hospital. The same as a dozen nights before. When she got home, Adrian was standing in the doorway with his phone in his hand, having already pulled up the location history on the family plan he controlled every account for. She called me the next morning, her voice tight and controlled in a way I hadn't heard from her before. He knows I've been at your house, she said. I told him the truth. Just talking. He didn't believe a word of it. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. He's telling people at his office that you and I have been having an affair. He's already told his mother. I felt the floor shift under a life I'd built specifically to avoid this kind of chaos. 2 days later, Adrian showed up at my studio door uninvited, letting himself through the side gate without knocking, standing in the middle of my mixing room like he owned the acoustic panels on the walls. I don't know what you think you're doing with my wife, he said, arms crossed, voice calm in the specific way that's more threatening than shouting, but I know exactly what it looks like from the outside, and so will everyone else in this neighborhood. I told him the truth. Nothing had happened. I had never touched her. I had never said a word I couldn't repeat to his face. But I also told him something I probably shouldn't have, standing there in my own studio with his shoes tracking mud onto my rug. I told him that if he wanted to know why his wife was talking to her neighbor at 11 at night instead of talking to her own husband, he might start by asking himself what kind of husband makes a person feel like midnight conversation with someone else is safer than an honest conversation with him. He didn't hit me. He didn't yell. He just stared at me for a long 3 seconds, the kind of stare that tells you a decision has already been made behind it, and said, You'll regret that, before walking out. What followed was the ugliest month of that whole story. Adrian told the neighborhood association, in vague enough language to avoid a defamation claim, that there had been concerning behavior involving a neighbor and his wife. He told his mother a version dressed up enough that she called Priya directly to accuse her of destroying her marriage before it had even technically ended. He hired a divorce attorney the very week he found out about our late-night talks, not because he wanted the divorce, but because he wanted leverage. Wanted Priya scared enough of losing everything that she'd apologize her way back into a marriage that had already been broken for years before I ever moved onto that street. Priya went quiet for almost 2 weeks. No texts, no 7:15 dog walks past my porch. I saw her car in the driveway some mornings and out most nights, and I understood without being told that she was being watched now, in a way she hadn't been before. That every movement she made was being logged as evidence in a case Adrian was building, not to save his marriage, but to win it the way he won every negotiation in his professional life. Then, on the first Tuesday of December, my phone buzzed at 11 at night, and my chest tightened before I even looked at the screen. It was her. "My husband's asleep," it said, the exact same 9 words, but this time there was a second line beneath it. I told him I want a divorce. He agreed, on one condition. He wants me to stop speaking to you completely, and he wants it in writing before he signs anything. I stood in my kitchen holding my phone, the studio red lights glowing faintly through the doorway behind me, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I typed back, "What do you want to do?" Her answer took almost 10 minutes to arrive. "I don't know yet. Can you meet me at the fence?" I walked outside into December, cold, breath fogging in front of me, and found her already standing there, arms wrapped tight around herself, eyes red in a way that told me she'd been crying long before that text arrived. "He's using you as a bargaining chip," she said. "If I sign a paper saying I'll never speak to you again, he'll let the divorce go through clean. No fighting, no dragging it out for 2 years, the way his lawyer says he could if he wanted to be cruel about it. And, if you don't sign it, he says he'll make it as expensive and as public as legally possible. He says he'll tell people things about you that aren't true, professionally, to your clients." She looked up at me. "I don't want to lose you over a piece of paper, Nathaniel. But I also don't want you to lose your business because I couldn't get free of him clean. I want to tell you I had an easy answer standing there in the cold. I didn't. What I had was a decision that took me the rest of that night and most of the next morning to make, sitting alone in my studio staring at a mixing board I couldn't focus enough to touch. I called her the next afternoon and told her what I'd decided. "Sign it," I said. "Get out clean. Don't let him drag this into something that costs you 2 years of your life over me." She was quiet for a long moment. "You're telling me to promise I'll never talk to you again." "I'm telling you to get free first," I said. "Whatever happens after that happens after you're actually free, not while he's still holding your whole life hostage to make a point." She signed the agreement 3 days later. Adrian's lawyer sent it over with the smugness you could practically feel through the paper. A clause specifying no contact of any kind between Priya and her neighbor for a period of 12 months following the finalized divorce, framed as a condition of an otherwise uncontested settlement. She signed it because it got her out fast, clean, without draining her savings on a legal war Adrian could afford to wage far longer than she could. For the next several months I didn't see her. Not at the fence, not on the greenway, not anywhere. She moved out of the blue bungalow within 6 weeks, and a for sale sign went up, where her rose bushes used to be, before a new owner ripped them out entirely. I went back to my old rhythm, the coffee, the runs, the studio. Except now every part of that rhythm felt hollow in a specific shape I recognized. The shape of a person who used to be there and now wasn't. I didn't try to find her. I respected the agreement even though I hadn't signed it, because breaking it would have meant costing her something in a settlement I had no legal stake in, but every emotional stake in protecting. Some nights I stood at that fence line anyway, just to remember what it had felt like to hear her voice out there in the cold. And I told myself that was allowed, standing in a spot, even if the person who used to stand there with me couldn't anymore. The 12 months ended on a Tuesday in the following December, almost exactly a year to the day from that first 11 o'clock text. I didn't expect anything. I told myself I wouldn't expect anything because expecting things from a woman who'd been forced to erase you from her life for a year felt like a good way to set myself up for disappointment. At 11:04 p.m. that Tuesday, my phone buzzed. I sat up so fast I nearly knocked my lamp off the nightstand. The name on the screen was hers, the number the same, unchanged after everything. The message read, It's been exactly a year. I counted every single day. Are you free to talk? I called her instead of texting. She picked up on the first ring, and the sound of her voice after a year's silence did something to my chest. I still don't have adequate words for, even doing this for a living, even having spent my whole career finding exactly the right words to describe a sound. We talked for 4 hours that night. She told me she'd moved into a small apartment in downtown Asheville, close enough to the hospital to walk some shifts. She told me the divorce had finalized without drama, exactly as promised, and that Adrian had already moved to Charlotte with someone new within 4 months, proving, she said, that the whole ordeal had never really been about losing her, only about losing control of the narrative. She told me she'd thought about texting me at 11 every single night for a year and had stopped herself every single time, counting down not days but literal hours until the clause expired. I asked her the question I'd been sitting on for a year. Why 11? She laughed, soft and real, the first laugh I'd heard from her in what felt like a lifetime. Because that's when Adrian used to fall asleep, she said. It was the only hour of the day that was actually mine, and somehow it became the hour you were awake too. We met in person 3 days later, at a coffee shop downtown neither of us had ever been to. Neutral ground, no fence line between us this time. She looked lighter than I'd ever seen her. The specific kind of lighter that comes from a year of no longer performing contentment for someone else's comfort. We talked for 2 hours over coffee that went cold, because neither of us wanted to break the conversation to reheat it. I won't pretend the next few months were simple. There was a strange caution between us at first, a habit built over a year of forced distance that took time to unlearn. But slowly, the same way small things had built between us before any of the chaos, small things built again. She started walking past my studio some evenings on her way home from a different job at a different pharmacy near downtown. Evenings, not mornings now, and we'd talk on the porch instead of at a fence that no longer separated two properties belonging to two different people. 6 months after that reunion call, she moved into a rental 2 streets over from mine, close enough to keep her own space, far enough to keep this from ever feeling like history repeating itself. We didn't rush anything. She'd already lived through what happens when your whole identity gets folded into someone else's decisions, and I respected that too much to ask her to fold herself into mine before she was ready. A year after that, I built her a small home studio of her own in the spare room of my house, not because she made music, but because she'd once told me at that old fence line that the only thing that had ever felt entirely hers was her work, and I wanted her to have a room in whatever life we built together that belonged to nobody but her. She cried when she saw it finished, not the fractured kind of crying I remembered from the divorce, but the kind that comes when someone finally believes they're allowed to take up space in a life without asking permission first.
2 years after that first 11 o'clock text, I asked her to marry me on the exact fence line where we used to stand, though the fence itself was long gone, the yard reshaped by new owners who'd never know what that patch of grass had witnessed. I didn't have a speech prepared. I just said, "It's 11 o'clock. I'm free to talk if you are." She laughed through tears and said yes before I'd even finished getting down on one knee. We got married the following spring in my backyard, under the same hardwood trees that turn gold every October, though by then they were green with new leaves instead. Her father walked her down a short grass aisle, the same father who had wanted her to become a doctor and had learned, slowly, to be proud of the pharmacist she'd become instead. Owen from the record label I worked with most often stood as my best man and made a joke in his toast about how I'd finally found something worth talking about after midnight besides mixing levels. We still talk at 11 some nights, out of habit more than necessity now, sitting together on the same porch where I used to drink my coffee alone every morning at 7:15, watching for a dog and a woman who I told myself for months meant nothing beyond neighborly kindness. I know now I was lying to myself the whole time. The same way she'd been performing contentment the whole time she stood married to a man who never once, in 6 years, asked her what she actually wanted from her own life. People ask me sometimes if I regret waiting as long as I did, standing at that fence for over a year without saying what I actually felt. I tell them the waiting wasn't wasted time. It was the only way either of us could be sure that what we built afterward belonged entirely to us, not to a marriage neither of us had broken, but both of us had watched fall apart from close enough to feel the wreckage. Sometimes the most important conversation of your life doesn't start with a declaration. It starts with 9 ordinary words sent at an hour when everyone else in the world is finally asleep. "My husband's asleep. Are you free to talk?" It sounds like nothing. It sounds like the kind of message you'd forget by morning. But for us, it was the first thread pulled loose in a life that had been quietly unraveling long before either of us admitted it out loud. So let me ask you something before you go. If your phone buzzed right now, at 11 at night, from someone you'd convinced yourself meant nothing more than friendship, would you answer it? And if you did, would you be honest about what you actually wanted? Or would you keep telling yourself it was only a conversation between neighbors? If this story made you feel something, hit that like button so I know it landed. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one every week. And drop a comment below. I read every single one. Tell me honestly, would you have answered that text at 11 o'clock? Or would you have let it sit until morning, telling yourself that was the safer choice? I'll see you in the next story.